They thought it was just a family inheritance dispute, until a little girl's laughter made the judge freeze. One whispered sentence, "It's him," reopened a deadly secret buried for 27 years, exposing a powerful man who believed the truth had died forever. If you enjoy emotional mystery stories with shocking twists and satisfying justice, subscribe to Calm Dad Stories and join us for more unforgettable journeys. I still remember the exact sound my daughter's laughter made when I stepped through the courtroom doors. It wasn't loud enough to interrupt the proceedings, but it was sharp enough to reach me across the polished wooden floor. Several people turned toward her before looking back at me. She wasn't trying to hide her amusement. She truly believed she had already won. Her husband, Everett Sloan Mercer, stood beside her with his arms folded, giving me nothing more than a slow shake of his head. To everyone watching, I probably looked exactly like the stubborn old man they had been hearing about for months. I carried no expensive briefcase, no entourage of attorneys, and no expression that suggested confidence. I simply walked toward the defense table, placed my worn leather folder in front of me, and quietly took my seat. I am Draven Kalervoss. I spent 34 years investigating structural disasters before disappearing from public life. Today, according to my own daughter, I was nothing more than a selfish father refusing to hand over property that rightfully belonged to her. If only the courtroom knew how wrong that story really was. The hearing had been scheduled for nearly 10 in the morning, but I arrived almost an hour early. Old habits never disappear. During my years as an investigator, arriving early often meant noticing details everyone else overlooked. Even after retirement, I found myself studying every hallway, every exit, every unfamiliar face. The courthouse itself was older than most buildings in the city. Dark oak panels lined the walls. Brass lamps reflected soft yellow light across the marble floor. Portraits of former judges watched silently from their frames as lawyers hurried from one courtroom to another. Nothing appeared unusual until I noticed a familiar face standing near one of the windows overlooking the courthouse square. Lucien Marrow Ashcroft. Time had added silver to his hair and softened the lines around his eyes, but I recognized him instantly. 27 years could change a man's appearance without changing the way he carried himself. His posture remained perfectly straight. His smile remained carefully measured. Even the expensive charcoal suit seemed chosen to communicate quiet authority instead of wealth. He was speaking to Celine as though he had known her forever. She nodded several times while he rested one reassuring hand on her shoulder. Watching them together made something tighten inside my chest. She trusted him completely. She had no idea who he truly was. Worse still, he clearly had no idea who I truly was. I lowered my head before either of them looked in my direction. There had been a time when newspapers printed my photograph almost every week. That had ended decades ago. Witness protection had erased my public identity so thoroughly that even former colleagues believed I had died overseas after retiring. My beard was now neatly trimmed instead of clean-shaven. My hair had turned completely gray. Age had altered my voice enough that most people never questioned it. Lucien walked past me without the slightest sign of recognition. He treated me like any other elderly defendant waiting for a routine civil hearing. That ignorance gave me a small advantage, although I doubted it would last forever. 3 months earlier, the lawsuit had arrived in a plain envelope without warning. Celine claimed I had intentionally withheld ownership of an abandoned warehouse that once belonged to our family. According to documents filed by her attorney, I had manipulated inheritance records shortly after my wife's death. She demanded the court transfer the property immediately. Reading those accusations had hurt more than I expected. Not because of the legal threat itself, but because every sentence proved how little my own daughter understood about the choices I had made. She believed I had disappeared from her life because I cared more about money than family. The truth was almost unbearable in its simplicity. I disappeared because remaining visible would have placed both of us in unimaginable danger. I could have explained everything years ago. I could have told her about the investigation that destroyed my career. I could have described the threats, the surveillance, the anonymous letters promising that my family would suffer if I continued asking questions. I could have shown her photographs that never appeared in official reports and records that were never entered into evidence. But each explanation carried the same risk. Every secret revealed increased the chance that unfinished business from the past would return. So I remained silent, allowing my daughter to mistake caution for indifference. Now that silence had brought us here, the bailiff called for everyone to rise as the judge entered the courtroom. Conversations immediately stopped. Chairs scraped across the floor before settling into complete stillness. I looked toward the bench for the first time. The judge adjusted his glasses while scanning the case file. His expression remained professional until his eyes lifted from the paperwork and met mine. Everything changed in that single moment. The color drained from his face. His fingers tightened around the edge of the bench so suddenly that several papers slipped onto the floor. Barely above a whisper, words escaped his lips that were never meant for the entire courtroom to hear. "My God, it's him." The whisper spread through the courtroom faster than any raised voice could have. Although the judge had spoken almost to himself, the silence inside the room carried every syllable farther than he intended. Attorneys exchanged puzzled glances. The court reporter briefly stopped typing before quickly catching up. Even Celine's smile disappeared as she looked from the judge to me, searching for an explanation neither of us offered. Judge Alaric Fenmore adjusted his glasses again, but his trembling hand betrayed the calm expression he was trying to regain. For several long seconds, he simply stared at me. Then he cleared his throat, closed the case file in front of him, and announced that the court would take a 15-minute recess before any arguments were heard. A wave of confusion swept across the room. Civil hearings rarely paused before they had even begun. Something had unsettled him, and everyone knew it. As people began filing into the hallway, I remained seated. I had seen that expression before. It was not fear of me. It was the shock of recognizing someone believed to be gone forever. 27 years earlier, Alaric Fenmore had not worn judicial robes. He had been an ambitious assistant prosecutor assigned to one of the largest structural disaster investigations in state history. Back then, I had testified in a secure government office rather than a public courtroom. We had spent weeks reviewing engineering reports, financial records, and inspection logs connected to the collapse of Haven Crest Civic Tower. Hundreds of families demanded answers after the disaster, but every path we followed seemed to end behind locked doors or missing documents. I remembered the frustration in Alaric's voice every time another witness withdrew a statement or another piece of evidence mysteriously disappeared. The official explanation blamed an unexpected earthquake that supposedly weakened the building's foundation. Newspapers repeated the government's conclusion for months. Television experts assured the public that no construction company could have predicted such an event. I knew those statements were false before the first press conference ended. My inspection team had recovered fractured steel beams whose internal composition did not match the approved specifications submitted during construction. Laboratory testing revealed excessive impurities and dangerously low structural strength. Someone had knowingly replaced certified materials with cheaper alternatives. Buildings fail for many reasons, but steel does not lie. Every microscopic crack told the same story. The tower had not collapsed because nature was stronger than engineers. It collapsed because greed had become more valuable than human lives. Following that evidence led us toward one company after another until every trail pointed in the same direction. Ashcroft Urban Developments. Officially, Lucien Marrow Ashcroft served only as executive chairman. According to public records, he never personally approved engineering purchases. Every suspicious contract carried another employee's signature. Every questionable payment passed through shell companies that vanished months later. Every conversation ended with someone claiming they simply followed procedure. Yet patterns began emerging that statistics could not ignore. Material substitutions occurred only on projects connected to Lucien's private investment network. Independent inspectors who questioned unusual invoices suddenly resigned or relocated. Several key accountants disappeared entirely from public records. The deeper I investigated, the more carefully someone erased the path ahead of me. Then came the threats. At first they were anonymous phone calls arriving after midnight. A calm voice advised me to stop reopening old reports. Days later, Unfamiliar cars remained parked outside my home from sunrise until long after dark. My wife pretended not to notice, but I often caught her watching through the curtains whenever headlights slowed near the driveway. One evening, I found every tire on my vehicle slashed without a single neighbor hearing anything unusual. A week later, an envelope appeared inside my mailbox containing nothing except a photograph of Celine walking home from school. No message accompanied the picture. None was necessary. The warning was unmistakable. Continue investigating, and your family becomes part of the story. Federal authorities finally intervened after someone tampered with my office elevator, causing it to plunge 2 floors before emergency brakes engaged. Investigators ruled it an act of deliberate sabotage. Within 48 hours, I was relocated to a secure location under a different identity while prosecutors attempted to preserve what remained of the case. Alaric personally handed me the relocation documents. He looked exhausted that evening, his tie hanging loose after nearly 16 consecutive hours of interviews. Before I left, he shook my hand and quietly said, "If this case survives, we'll bring them back to court someday." Neither of us imagined that someday would take nearly 3 decades. A knock on the courtroom door interrupted my thoughts. Judge Fenmore entered a private conference room where I had been asked to wait during the recess. For a long moment, he simply looked at me without speaking. His eyes searched my face, as though confirming that memory had not betrayed him. Finally, he closed the door behind him and lowered his voice. "Draven Kalervas," he said carefully, almost unable to believe the words himself. "The government informed us that you were dead." I met his gaze without looking away. "That report kept my daughter alive," I answered quietly. Before he could respond, another knock echoed through the room. A court clerk stepped inside, visibly nervous. "Your Honor," she said, "there's something you need to see in the archive records. It concerns the warehouse at the center of today's lawsuit." The court clerk introduced herself as Narissa Vale Rowan. She appeared to be in her early 40s, dressed in a navy cardigan instead of the formal attire most courthouse employees preferred. A pair of reading glasses rested on top of her head, and she carried 3 aging file boxes that looked as though they had not been opened in years. Despite the obvious weight of the records, her voice remained steady. "Your Honor," she said, placing the boxes carefully on the conference table, "I wasn't searching for anything related to the Haven Crest investigation. I was only tracing the ownership history of the warehouse listed in today's inheritance dispute. But I found references that don't make sense." Judge Fenmore glanced toward me before opening the first box. "Show us everything," he replied. I stood silently beside the table, watching decades of forgotten paperwork return to the light. Narissa explained that the courthouse had recently begun digitizing old property records. Most employees avoided the archive because the basement storage rooms were dusty, poorly organized, and filled with files dating back more than half a century. She had spent nearly 2 weeks matching handwritten deeds with electronic records when she noticed an unusual discrepancy. The warehouse owned by my late wife carried a restricted archival reference, normally reserved for sealed criminal evidence rather than ordinary real estate documentation. Curious, she requested authorization to inspect the original registry books. Instead of finding mortgage records, she discovered transfer orders signed by a retired court administrator 27 years earlier. The warehouse had briefly been designated as a secure judicial storage facility before quietly returning to private ownership less than a year later. No explanation accompanied the paperwork. Judge Fenmore slowly turned each yellowed page while listening without interruption. The signatures looked authentic. The dates aligned perfectly with the final months of the abandoned Haven Crest prosecution. My heartbeat quickened. I had known evidence was relocated several times before my disappearance, but I had never learned where everything ultimately ended up. Federal officials intentionally kept certain details from me after entering witness protection. If Narissa was correct, then a portion of the investigation had never left the courthouse's authority at all. It had simply vanished beneath layers of forgotten administrative records. I looked at the property diagrams spread across the table and immediately recognized the warehouse floor plan. My wife had inherited the building from her father years before we married. I had always assumed its only value was sentimental. Now I realized someone else had known something I did not. A memory surfaced with startling clarity. During the final week before my relocation, a senior evidence coordinator insisted several physical exhibits would be stored temporarily in a secure off-site location because the central evidence vault had exceeded capacity. I remembered signing transportation forms, but never reading the destination address. We were exhausted, overwhelmed, and convinced the prosecution would move forward within months. Instead, the investigation collapsed under political pressure before those exhibits were ever introduced in court. One by one, the people involved accepted transfers, early retirement, or reassignment. The public believed every important piece of evidence had disappeared. Perhaps no one had bothered looking in the right place. Judge Fenmore leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together. If these archive references are accurate, he said quietly, the warehouse basement may still contain sealed judicial storage compartments. Narissa nodded. I found maintenance blueprints as well. They show reinforced rooms beneath the original foundation. The blueprints were filed separately from the property deeds under a restricted engineering classification. I don't think anyone has entered those rooms in decades. The room fell silent. I noticed the judge studying me again, measuring possibilities that had seemed impossible less than an hour earlier. If evidence truly remained beneath that building, today's inheritance dispute had suddenly become something far more significant. Before anyone could speak again, hurried footsteps echoed outside the conference room. A courthouse security officer knocked once before opening the door. Your Honor, he reported, breathing heavily. Mr. Ashcroft has requested permission to postpone today's hearing. His legal team says new procedural concerns have arisen. The judge's eyebrows lifted slightly. Procedural concerns? He repeated. The officer nodded. Yes, sir. They insist additional time is necessary before continuing. I couldn't help noticing the timing. Only 30 minutes earlier Lucien had appeared perfectly confident. Now, without hearing a single piece of evidence, he suddenly wanted delay. Something had unsettled him. Whether he knew about the warehouse or merely sensed the judge's unexpected reaction to me, I couldn't yet determine. Judge Fenmore declined the request immediately. Tell counsel the hearing will proceed as scheduled, he instructed. After the officer departed, he turned back toward us. I want independent officers present before anyone enters that warehouse. No private security. No outside contractors. If there is even the slightest possibility that sealed evidence still exists, its chain of custody must be protected from this moment forward. Narissa agreed without hesitation and produced one final document from the bottom of the last box. It was an inventory ledger listing numbered storage compartments beneath the warehouse basement. Most entries had faded with age, but one line remained perfectly legible. Beside compartment 7, someone had written in red ink, Original material exhibits, do not destroy. I stared at those words as a chill traveled through me. After 27 years of silence, the past had finally left us a map. 2 hours after the hearing was suspended, a convoy of courthouse vehicles rolled through the rusted gates of the warehouse. Rain clouds gathered overhead, covering the afternoon sky with a dull gray light that made the abandoned property appear even older than I remembered. The building stood at the edge of the industrial district where factories had once operated day and night. Most neighboring structures had either been demolished or converted into storage facilities years ago. Only our warehouse remained almost untouched. Faded paint peeled from its brick walls, broken windows reflected the overcast sky, and weeds had pushed through cracks in the concrete loading dock. Celine stepped out of her car and stared at the building with visible confusion. I've never even been inside, she admitted quietly.
Neither had I.
My wife inherited it long before we married, but we always treated it as little more than an aging piece of family property. Now, every person standing outside understood that its greatest value had never been the building itself. Judge Fenmore authorized a complete forensic inspection before anyone crossed the entrance. Officers photographed every doorway, every lock, and every visible corner of the property to preserve the chain of evidence. Narissa remained beside the investigators, carefully comparing each room against the decades-old blueprints she had recovered from the archives. I watched as she counted support columns beneath her breath before stopping near the rear storage area. She pointed toward an unusually thick section of the concrete floor. According to the engineering plans, she explained, there should be an access corridor directly beneath this location. At first glance, nothing distinguished the floor from the surrounding surface. Dust covered every inch of it. Wooden crates, untouched for years, had been stacked across the area. Yet the measurements matched perfectly. Workers carefully removed the crates before using ground-penetrating radar borrowed from the city's infrastructure department. Minutes later, the technician looked up with unmistakable surprise. Beneath the concrete lay an empty chamber extending nearly 40 feet below the warehouse. Specialists spent the next 3 hours removing the reinforced floor section without damaging anything underneath. Every step was documented on video. No one wanted future defense attorneys claiming contamination or misconduct. As the final slab lifted away, a narrow steel staircase emerged from the darkness below. The air rising from the hidden chamber smelled dry rather than damp, suggesting the underground room had remained remarkably well sealed. Flashlights illuminated concrete walls lined with aging electrical conduits that somehow still appeared intact. At the bottom of the stairs stood a heavy steel security door coated with decades of dust. Across its center remained an official judicial seal that had yellowed with age, but showed no sign of tampering. My pulse quickened. 27 years earlier, I believed every physical exhibit connected to Haven Crest had been lost forever. Instead, they had waited beneath this forgotten warehouse while entire careers ended and countless families accepted incomplete answers. The locksmith assigned to the investigation examined the door for several minutes before announcing something no one expected. "The lock hasn't been forced," he said. "In fact, I don't think it's been opened since it was closed." Judge Fenmore ordered every camera in the room to begin recording before permission was given to unlock it. The old mechanism resisted at first, producing a metallic groan that echoed through the underground corridor. Then, with one final turn of the key, the bolts released. 2 officers slowly pulled the heavy door open. Dust drifted into the flashlight beams as stale air escaped from the sealed chamber. Inside stood rows of metal shelving covered with numbered evidence, containers exactly as described in Nerissa's inventory ledger. Nothing appeared disturbed. Labels still hung from the shelves. Evidence tape remained unbroken. Time itself seemed frozen inside that room. I stepped forward only after receiving permission from the judge. Every shelf triggered another memory. There were boxes containing fractured steel bolts recovered from the collapse. Plastic containers held concrete core samples collected from the building's foundation. Filing cabinets contained engineering correspondence and procurement contracts. Then I saw the cabinet marked with the number 7. My breathing slowed. Compartment 7. The same number highlighted in red ink on the inventory ledger. An evidence officer carefully cut the original seal before opening the cabinet under continuous video recording. Inside rested several thick binders, dozens of photographic negatives, sealed laboratory reports, and a weathered leather notebook secured inside a transparent evidence bag. I recognized it immediately. It was my original field journal. Every observation I made during the Haven Crest investigation had been written inside those pages by hand because I never trusted electronic records alone. The notebook was transferred onto a clean examination table while forensic specialists changed into fresh gloves. Every page was photographed before anyone touched the paper. As the first entries became visible, I felt transported back to the investigation that had changed my life. Dates, inspection notes, conversations with engineers, serial numbers from steel shipments, laboratory references, and names of subcontractors filled page after page in my own handwriting. Near the center of the journal, several paragraphs described a private meeting with purchasing executives who insisted cheaper structural materials would never be discovered after construction finished. Tucked between 2 pages was a folded carbon copy of an internal authorization form bearing a signature I had not seen in nearly 3 decades. Lucien Marrow Ashcroft. Not a copied signature. Not a scanned image. The original ink remained visible despite the passage of time. Judge Fenmore stared silently at the document before looking toward the forensic examiner. "Authenticate everything," he ordered. "No assumptions. No shortcuts. I want every page verified independently." The examiner nodded and immediately sealed the notebook for laboratory processing. 3 days later, The courthouse looked nothing like it had on the morning my daughter laughed at me. Television crews filled the sidewalks outside. Reporters waited behind metal barriers, hoping to capture even a brief statement from anyone connected to the reopened Haven Crest investigation. Additional security officers guarded every entrance, checking identification before allowing anyone inside. What had started as an inheritance dispute had become the most significant criminal proceeding the city had seen in decades. I walked through the same front doors carrying the same worn leather folder, but this time dozens of strangers turned to watch me. They still did not know my story. They only knew that an elderly man at the center of a family lawsuit had somehow reopened a case everyone believed was buried forever. Celine stood near the entrance to courtroom 3. Unlike our previous hearing, she did not avoid looking at me. She appeared exhausted. Dark circles surrounded her eyes, and the confidence she once carried had completely disappeared. She took a hesitant step toward me before stopping. "Dad," she said quietly, struggling to find the right words, "I didn't know any of this." I studied her face for several seconds before answering. "I know." She lowered her eyes. "Lucien told me you had hidden the warehouse because you wanted to sell it without telling me. He showed me financial records and legal opinions. Everything looked convincing." I nodded slowly. That was the point. Before either of us could continue, the bailiff announced that the hearing was about to begin. We entered the courtroom separately, but for the first time in many years, I no longer felt that my daughter stood entirely on the opposite side. Lucien Marrow Ashcroft arrived moments later surrounded by 3 defense attorneys. He wore another perfectly tailored suit, yet something about him had changed. His expression lacked the effortless confidence I had seen only days earlier. He smiled for the cameras waiting outside, but once he entered the courtroom, that smile disappeared almost immediately. Judge Fenmore wasted no time reviewing the newly recovered evidence. The forensic laboratory had completed its preliminary examination during the previous 48 hours. Every document recovered from Compartment 7 showed consistent aging. The ink composition matched manufacturing standards from 27 years earlier. Paper fibers corresponded with office supplies commonly used during the original investigation. Most importantly, handwriting specialists confirmed that the signatures attributed to Lucien were authentic with an extremely high degree of certainty. Murmurs spread across the gallery as each finding became part of the official record. Then the prosecution introduced its newest witness. The retired materials engineer who had contacted investigators after hearing about the warehouse entered the courtroom under police protection. His name was Roland Evercade. His shoulders were slightly bent with age, but his voice remained remarkably steady. He admitted that fear had kept him silent for nearly 3 decades. During direct examination, he explained how Lucien personally instructed senior engineers to replace certified structural steel with significantly cheaper shipments purchased through overseas intermediaries. Roland testified that he objected to the substitutions because independent testing showed the material failed to meet minimum safety requirements. According to his testimony, Lucien dismissed those concerns, insisting no one would ever inspect the completed framework closely enough to notice the difference. Roland also revealed that several executives received undisclosed bonus payments shortly after approving the material changes. Financial records recovered from the underground archive supported every major point of his statement. Lucien remained silent throughout most of the testimony. His attorneys objected repeatedly, but each objection was overruled after prosecutors connected Roland's statements to physical evidence recovered beneath the warehouse. Finally, during a short recess, Lucien stood and requested permission to address the court directly. Against the advice of his own legal team, he insisted the recovered evidence had been manipulated before being sealed decades earlier. "Those documents prove nothing," he declared confidently. "I've reviewed engineering reports like those before. They're incomplete. They don't even include the revised procurement summaries that were stored beside them." The moment those words left his mouth, every attorney in the courtroom stopped writing. Judge Fenmore slowly removed his glasses and looked directly at Lucien. "Mr. Ashcroft," he said evenly, "how do you know what was stored beside those reports?" Silence followed immediately. The prosecution had never described the exact arrangement of the evidence shelves. Investigators had intentionally withheld that information from the public. Only people who had personally entered the storage room before it was sealed could have known how the materials were organized. Lucien's face lost its color almost instantly. One of his attorneys whispered urgently into his ear, but the damage had already been done. Prosecutor Helena Vossler rose from her seat and requested permission to enter an additional exhibit into evidence. It was the original inventory photograph taken moments after Compartment 7 had been opened. The image clearly showed the procurement summaries positioned exactly where Lucien had described them. Judge Fenmore admitted the photograph without hesitation. The courtroom became so quiet that the sound of camera shutters from the press section echoed across the room. Investigators immediately requested authorization to review Lucien's historical financial records alongside the recovered procurement documents. Before the hearing concluded for the day, another remarkable development emerged. Two former Ashcroft executives, each represented by separate attorneys, informed prosecutors that they were prepared to testify in exchange for reduced charges. Lucien had spent 27 years convincing everyone that loyalty could be purchased forever. Now, faced with undeniable evidence, the people who once protected him had begun protecting themselves instead. 6 months passed before the final judgment was delivered. During that time, the investigation expanded far beyond the walls of the courthouse. Teams of forensic accountants traced financial transactions through shell corporations spread across several countries. Structural engineers re-examined archived construction records from projects completed under Lucien Marrow Ashcroft's companies. Detectives interviewed retired executives, former inspectors, suppliers, and contractors who had remained silent for decades. Every new interview seemed to confirm another detail preserved inside the evidence recovered beneath the warehouse. The forgotten storage room had not merely reopened an old criminal case. It had become the foundation upon which an entire network of deception was exposed piece by piece. By the time the trial reached its conclusion, prosecutors no longer argued that Lucien had made a series of careless business decisions. They demonstrated that he had directed an organized system designed to maximize profit while deliberately concealing dangerous construction defects, bribing officials, intimidating witnesses, and destroying public trust. On the morning of the verdict, I arrived before sunrise. The courthouse steps were already crowded with journalists, despite the cold air. Satellite trucks lined both sides of the street, and cameras pointed toward every entrance. Officers established additional security checkpoints because public interest had grown beyond anything the city expected. As I walked through the metal detectors, I realized something had changed inside me as well. For nearly 27 years, I had lived with the constant belief that looking over my shoulder was simply part of everyday life. Every unfamiliar vehicle, every unexpected phone call, every stranger lingering outside my home reminded me that unfinished business still existed somewhere beyond my reach. That burden had shaped countless decisions, including the painful distance I allowed to grow between myself and my daughter. Standing inside the courthouse that morning, I felt that invisible weight becoming lighter for the first time in decades. Celine met me outside the courtroom carrying a small envelope. She looked nervous, but determined. "Before we go in," she said softly, "there's something I need you to have." She handed me the envelope without another word. Inside was a copy of the lawsuit she had filed against me months earlier. Across the front page, she had written a single sentence in blue ink. "I was wrong and I am sorry." My eyes remained fixed on those words for several moments before I folded the document carefully and returned it to the envelope. "You don't owe me a perfect past," I told her quietly. "You only owe yourself an honest future." Tears filled her eyes as she nodded. There were no dramatic embraces, no attempt to erase years of misunderstanding in a single conversation. Real healing rarely happens that way. But for the first time in many years, we entered the courtroom together instead of from opposite sides. Judge Fenmore began reading the verdict shortly after 9 o'clock. His voice remained calm and measured throughout the lengthy decision. The court found Lucien Marrow Ashcroft guilty on multiple counts, including conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of justice, evidence suppression, witness intimidation, bribery, and criminal negligence, resulting in numerous deaths connected to the Haven Crest collapse. Additional financial crimes uncovered during the investigation resulted in further convictions involving tax fraud and money laundering. The courtroom remained silent until the final sentence was announced. Lucien was ordered to serve a lengthy prison term with no possibility of early release under the applicable statutes. His business empire would be dismantled through court-supervised liquidation. Properties, investment accounts, luxury estates, corporate shares, and offshore assets would be seized to establish a compensation fund for surviving victims and their families. The empire he had spent decades protecting would now be used to repair a fraction of the damage it had caused. Lucien did not react immediately. He remained seated, staring straight ahead while officers approached from both sides. Only after one officer instructed him to stand did he slowly rise to his feet. As he turned toward the gallery, our eyes met one final time. Years earlier, I had imagined confronting him with anger if this day ever arrived. Instead, I felt something entirely different: relief. Hatred would have allowed him to occupy space inside my life forever. Justice allowed me to leave him behind. Without saying a word, he was escorted through a side door reserved for prisoners. Flashing cameras captured his departure from outside the courthouse, where the public watched the once celebrated businessman disappear into a correctional transport vehicle. His reputation, carefully polished over decades, collapsed within a single afternoon because the truth had survived longer than his lies. Weeks later, the warehouse was officially transferred into a public historical trust. Rather than selling the property, Celine and I agreed that the underground evidence room should remain preserved as part of an educational exhibit honoring the victims of the Haven Crest disaster and the investigators who refused to abandon the search for the truth. Schools, engineering students, and public officials would eventually visit the site to understand how corruption can hide behind respectable appearances and why accountability must never depend upon convenience. Narissa Vale Rowan accepted recognition from the state for her careful archival work, though she insisted she had only been doing her job. Judge Fenmore retired several months after the trial concluded, telling reporters that witnessing justice delayed had reminded him why he entered public service in the first place. As for me, I finally visited my wife's grave carrying no classified documents, no false identity, and no fear that someone might be watching from a distance. I told her everything had finally ended.